In this video, I'm going to review the very shiny and very titanium Bearclaw Thunderhawk. Could this possibly be the most supple bike I have ever reviewed on the channel? Find out in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you love to ride party pace and are into the non-competitive side of cycling, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. And just a quick note, if you enjoy the content, consider supporting the channel and joining us on Patreon, where you'll get extra access, some fun kind of community perks, up to 25% off of certain brands. So support the channel and save some money at the same time. The Bearclaw Thunderhawk is a bike that has intrigued me from the very first moment I learned about it. It took a while to get a bike to review, but boy, I'm pretty glad I waited. If you're not familiar with the brand Bearclaw, I actually got a chance to review their other bike, or one of their other bikes, the Bo Jackson. So if you're curious about that bike, it's kind of a super monster cross version of this bike. I'll link to it up here somewhere. So what is the Thunderhawk? Well, the bike I got to review in particular is the all-tie version. They sell versions with a titanium frame and a carbon fork, but I wanted the full-on tie experience. So starting from the front, it's got a really cool looking titanium fork. Although it looks big and chunky and would appear stiff, it's actually very, very smooth. I'll get more into that later in the video. The fork has 3-pack mounts, so it doesn't sacrifice a lot of utility up front. This particular build is spec'd out with some really fancy parts. First of all, some Envy carbon gravel bars, as well as full-on electronic axis shifting. That's right, I've been poking fun at the axis mullet system, and I finally got a chance to ride it. Look for a video soon where I compared the electronic axis version of the mullet with my own homebrew method. Moving further back, it's outfitted with a whiskey branded stem. Interior triangle has 3-pack mounts, so this is great because it gives you lots of adjustability with your bottle cages. So if you're running a half-frame bag, you can move those bottle cages up and down. In terms of cranks, this bike is set up one by, it's got SRAM force cranks with a 40-tooth chainring. Once again, linked up all fancy and wireless with the SRAM axis rear derailleur. Seat post is an oversized seat post by Whiskey, and this is a very popular WTB Volt. This bike is spec'd out 650B, although you could also run it set up 700C. Maximum tire clearance for 700C is 700 by 50. If you run it 650B, you can squeeze a 2.3-inch tire in there. So lots of flexibility. You can put some fat meats if you're going on some really rough terrain, or some less fat meats if you're doing more pavement or hard surface riding. The wheels themselves are a mix of DT Swiss hubs and with some Bearclaw branded carbon hoops. I also forgot to mention that in the rear there are also rack mounts. You can run a rear rack if you want to. So although there are lots of performance-oriented bits on this, because of all the rack mounts, it is super functional, lots of utility. On our scales, the bike weighed in minus pedals at just over 20 pounds at 20.4 pounds, or that is 9.25 kilograms. Okay, bear with me folks, it is on the spendy side. Frame with the tie fork comes in at just under $2,600. And in terms of a complete build, I'm not quite sure because this one isn't spec'd out on their website, but my guess is that it's in at least the $5,000 to $6,000 range. So yes, let's get it over with. It is an expensive bike. I know. All that stuff aside, how does the bike ride? Because of course, that is the most important thing about any bike. So I've had this bike for a couple months and have been taking it on a ton of mixed terrain day rides, both in Los Angeles and down in Tucson. Rode some paved surfaces, did some gravel climbs, a little bit of single track. So I feel like I got a pretty good sense about how the bike handles. One other note, when it initially shipped, it had some Schwalbe G1s, which I eventually swapped out to a slightly less fat meat, just so I could get a full sense of the ride feel and kind of distinguish kind of the supple characteristics of the tire from the frame material. First thing I noticed is how well the bike climbed. Fairly lightweight, and it's got some carbon hoops on it. So going uphill was an absolute joy on the bike. So the rear chainstay was a little bit shorter than your standard all-rounder 430 at 428. So I had some nice rear end quickness and also climbed pretty well while standing. In terms of the front end of the bike, this is where things got a little bit interesting because like I mentioned, it initially shipped with those much larger Schwalbe G1s, and I rode on that big tire for a couple weeks. And one thing I noticed is when you are using a tire that big, it really increases the front end trail. So my initial impressions were that it was kind of quick in the rear, but noticeably a little bit more slow steering in the front. This only really became apparent when going uphill very slowly. The bike had a tendency to wander. Not unique to this bike, but bikes generally with higher trail, that's just what they do. Of course, once I got the bike up to speed, and particularly going downhill, the higher trail number really came into play and made the bike a super stable, super confident descender. And for me, I actually prefer a little bit higher trail on a gravel bike that's meant to go on some rougher terrain or some occasional single track. I do think it benefits from that stability going downhill. Like I mentioned earlier, I did swap out the tires. I wanted to get a sense of how the bike rides with tires that are more familiar to me. So I swapped them out for some 650B by 48 WTB Ventures. And this was a fairly big surprise because the bike became more road-like, if you will. There's definitely less tire to push around, so it just accelerated and climbed a bit better. And also by reducing that tire size, it lowered the trail and the front end just became a little bit more lively. So I found that pretty interesting. Depending on what tire size, it will affect the overall handling of the bike. Again, not unique to this bike, but pretty cool to see that in action. Another reason I swapped out to a smaller tire is because I was trying to differentiate what I was feeling from the tire as opposed to the frame. So I've ridden a ton of 650B by 48mm tires, so I have a good sense of what that feels like, and I could better differentiate it from the frame material. And if there is an adjective I would use to describe the overall feel of the bike, is that it is smooth. Quite a bit shockingly smooth. Best way I can describe it is, imagine you're riding the bike and then you get a slight shot of Novocaine all over and everything is just slightly dulled down. I know that sounds like a terrible thing, but that was kind of the sensation. The frame material with the tires really deadened kind of all those high frequency road vibrations, making the bike smooth as butter and really ideal for those long all-day bike rides where you don't want to be fatigued from getting vibrated to death. I think one of the things that really attracted me to this bike was that it had a tie fork. For whatever reason, you don't see many tie forks out there on the market. You look at Moots, you look at Linsky, all their bikes are typically spec'd out with a carbon fork. So really quite rare to see a bike with any tie fork whatsoever. And what I thought was fascinating was, even though the fork looks big and chunky with these big segmented tubes, it's actually very compliant. I wouldn't quite say noodly, but it did a pretty amazing job in terms of sucking up road vibration, even small to medium-sized hit. I personally love the feel for it. I know that some people want a really, kind of knife edge, precise feel in the front end. For me, I'm okay with something a little bit softer and really value getting some suspension, some suppleness in the front end without resorting to an actual front shock and all that stuff. So quite an eye-opener riding an all-tie bike. I know a lot of you are going to be asking me, how does titanium compared to aluminum, to steel, to carbon? And I would say in this particular case, this bike is definitely a lot smoother feeling than certainly any carbon bike ever ridden, or aluminum bike, and any steel bike that I can think of in recent memory. I know my metaphor of a full body Novocaine shot does not sound very appealing, but that's kind of the sensation. Everything was dulled down in a nice, kind of pleasant way. Again, if you're used to getting all that feedback from a carbon road bike that's super stiff, riding a bike like this might be a little unsettling, and you might not even like it. It could feel like it's a little bit on the mushy side. But for me, I like compliant bikes. So what are my likes and dislikes? The first big like is that it is a very supple bike. And I think it's supple in a different way than something like the Northern Lion bike, which I tested, which had very small tubing, and you felt a lot of frame flex. This is supple in that it kind of dulls road vibrations pretty well. Doesn't necessarily flex as much as a super thin-walled steel bike, but it just smooths out the ride in kind of a almost eerie manner, especially if you run some bigger meets like the Schwabe G1. I love that this bike has a ton of utility. I think we're seeing a trend towards more gravel racy bikes, and it's nice that this bike still has a utility. It's got 3-pack mounts, it's got rear rack. So if you're looking for a one and done, do it all bike that's high performance but still functional, then this is definitely a great candidate. One last like is the tie fork. I think that's what really sets this bike apart. A ton of tie bikes out there with carbon forks, but this makes this bike unique. Lots of carbon forks aren't able to take a front rack. I would have no issue putting a rack on this. So you get all that suppleness, but also the burliness and lack of existential doubt that, you know, you have a carbon fork and it's going to explode if you put a front rack on there. All that is gone. So what are the things I dislike? You know, a big thing that will give many people pause is, of course, the price tag. You know, frame and fork is $2,600 alone. This particular build definitely well north of 5K. So that is without a doubt a barrier. Lastly, the front end geometry had a little bit higher trail than I would have preferred. I mean, I did ultimately adapt to it. I would have liked something a little bit sharper, maybe a fork a little bit more offset to bring that trail number down so it felt more road-like. But again, that's my personal preference, as we're seeing from bikes like the Chamois Hagar. Super slack gravel bikes are now a thing, and if that's your thing and you want it in all tie, then the Bearclaw Thunderhawk is definitely a bike to look at. It's not super high trail like the Chamois Hagar, but it is definitely a higher trail than many of the road or cross-inspired gravel bikes out there on the market. So overall, a lot to like. This bike is super fun, super supple, and really ticks all my boxes. I mean, if I had unlimited funds or if I could sell many of my bikes, I would definitely put the Bearclaw Thunderhawk on the list. I can see it replacing a ton of different bikes. If you put smaller, smoother tread tires on there, it could be a nice, chill, but super supple road bike. You can put beefier tires on there, up to 2.3 to take it bike packing. Could replace the use of my Cutthroat for those instances. So yeah, I'm really stoked on this bike. That is what I think. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you have any other questions, let me know. I will try to answer them within the first day or two of the release of the video. If you want to see more bike reviews, definitely check out the playlist. Consider supporting us on Patreon. And as always, keep the supple side down.